Welcome, everyone. Okay, let's just dive right into today's explainer because we've got a lot to cover. We're looking at a complete, chronological autopsy of literally the most infamous maritime disaster in human history. Now look, we've all heard the stories, right? But today, we're actually going to break down the compounding human and mechanical errors. Specifically, 6 absolutely fatal mistakes that doomed the supposedly unsinkable Titanic. We're going to see exactly how a chain of totally, completely avoidable blunders turned a maiden voyage into an absolute tragedy.
1,200 days. Just think about that number for a second. It took a massive crew of 2,000 workers over 3 years of painstaking, backbreaking labor to build this absolute engineering marvel. I mean, it was the crown jewel of the ocean. And yet, despite those 1,200 days of construction, it took only a couple of hours for the ocean to just swallow it completely. So you really have to ask yourself, how does a vessel guided by a captain with 40 years of experience fail so catastrophically?
Well, to understand the tragedy, we first need to understand the stark class divide on board. A third-class ticket was around $30, but a first-class ticket, that was a whopping $150. And to put that into perspective for us today, that $150 is equivalent to about 340,000 rupees now. No joke. This ship was literally a floating palace for the world's elite. And as you'll see in a minute, catering to all that immense wealth played a huge, fatal role in the disaster.
So, the Titanic departs Southampton on April 10, 1912. The ultimate destination is New York, but the absolutely crucial point here is the immense pressure placed on Captain Edward Smith by the ship's owners. They had set this crazy strict deadline: arrive in New York by April 17th. They wanted a super-fast, triumphant arrival within just 7 days to cement the Titanic's global reputation. And honestly, that intense corporate pressure, that sets the exact stage for our very first fatal error.
Which brings us to mistake number 1, rushing into danger.
Because of that super rigid April 17th deadline, Captain Smith violated basic safety limits. He pushed the ship to speed recklessly right through the Atlantic. They left the Southampton port so fast that they were essentially just throwing safety out the window for speed. And as they sped forward, the conditions got worse. By the evening of April 14th, the ocean was dead quiet, and this really thick fog had rolled in, severely dropping visibility. But here's the thing, the Titanic wasn't flying blind. Or, well, it shouldn't have been. Another ship slightly ahead of them had already hit ice. Over the wireless radio, at least 6 clear warnings about massive icebergs ahead were transmitted to the Titanic. 6 warnings, but incredibly, no way around it, they were completely disregarded.
So why on earth were those warnings ignored? That is mistake number 2. The wireless operators on board had this dangerous obsession with serving the wealthy passengers. Because the Titanic was absolutely packed with VIPs, the communications team was totally distracted. They were just swamped, busy sending and receiving personal messages for all these first-class elites. They prioritized luxury service over relaying critical, life-saving danger warnings to the captain. If those operators had just taken those 6 iceberg alerts seriously, the entire outcome of this voyage would have been totally different.
And that leads us to mistake 3, a shockingly tiny oversight with fatal consequences.
Up on deck, the alert guards were in position, ready to go, but they were missing one basic, super essential piece of equipment: binoculars. Without them, in that incredibly thick fog, they had to rely entirely on just their naked eyes. So by the time they finally spotted the massive iceberg, and we're talking about an iceberg the size of a football field here, it was just way too late. It's a terrifying butterfly effect when you really think about it, because they lacked a simple pair of binoculars. Turning that massive, speeding ship away in time became mathematically impossible. Despite a desperate, absolute last-minute order from Captain Smith to stop the engines and turn the ship, the distance was simply too short. The iceberg scraped right along the center of the ship.
But ships hit icebergs and survive, so why didn't the Titanic? Well, that brings us right to mistake 4, the fatal mechanical failure.
The massive metal plates of the ship's hull were held together not by steel, but by cast iron rivets, and cast iron is significantly softer than steel. When the massive pressure of the iceberg scraped against the hull, those softer cast iron rivets literally popped open under the stress. It's crazy. If they had just used stronger steel rivets, the hull might have dented instead of basically ripping wide open.
And this triggered a horrific chain reaction. It's a really stark reminder of the dangers of overconfidence in technology, The Titanic was genuinely engineered with state-of-the-art safety in mind. It was designed to stay completely afloat even if 3 of its lower floors entirely flooded. But because those iron rivets popped over such a massive long stretch of the ship, the water didn't stop at 3 floors. It breached the 4th floor, and once that 4th level began filling with freezing water, the legendary unsinkable design officially failed. At that point, the ship was mathematically guaranteed to go down.
Okay, mistake number 5, the evacuation disaster.
So, with the lower decks filling with water, the grim reality finally sets in, and Captain Smith issues the emergency radio alert. But instead of an organized rescue, sheer panic totally takes over. For a ship carrying over 1,500 passengers, it required at least 32 lifeboats to safely evacuate everyone. But due to immense negligence and, again, that overconfidence in the ship's design, there were only 20 lifeboats actually on board. Think about that. Over 1,500 lives and only room for a fraction of them.
And finally, we hit mistake number 6, the botched launch.
At 12:45 a.m., the chaotic evacuation officially began. Now, with way too few boats, every single seat was worth its weight in gold. But in the sheer panic and total confusion of the night, lifeboats were actually lowered into the ocean partially empty. Yeah, instead of maximizing every single available seat to ensure survival, a severe class bias took over. First-class, wealthy passengers were heavily prioritized. Had they simply filled those lifeboats to their actual capacity, hundreds more human lives could have absolutely been saved from those freezing waters.
Let's just step through those chilling final moments. The first partially empty boat hits the water at 12:45 a.m. For over an hour, absolute panic sweeps the sinking deck. By 2:18 a.m., the flooding causes a massive electrical short circuit, and all the ship's lights suddenly just go black. Seconds later, the sheer weight of the water causes the mighty Titanic to snap completely into 2 pieces. And in just 2 hours and 40 minutes from the very moment of impact, the greatest ship ever built is completely submerged, sinking all the way to the dark bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
The aftermath was just utterly devastating. The water temperature that night was a freezing -2 degrees Celsius. Even if passengers managed to jump and survive the actual fall, human beings can really only survive in temperatures that low for a maximum of 30 minutes. In the end, over 1,500 lives were lost to the freezing Atlantic. The survivors were mostly women and children who had made it onto those scattered lifeboats. And as for Captain Smith, well, he stayed true to naval tradition, spending his final moments trying to help others before going down with his ship. We've looked at the intense corporate pressure, the totally ignored warnings, the missing binoculars, the cheap iron rivets, and that horrifying lack of lifeboats. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question to really think about. When you look at this chain of entirely avoidable blunders, did the Titanic truly sink because of an iceberg? Or did it sink because of human pride and negligence? Thank you so much for joining me today, and hey, always keep questioning the history you think you know.